Okay. Hello and welcome to Mindful Conversations, a webinar series organized by the Canadian Centre for Mindful Habitats and the Bachelor of Interior Design program, Algonquin College, Ottawa. Today we have two wonderful speakers with us, Kavita Jain from Jaipur and Shannon Bassett from Sudbury. And we are looking forward to this wonderful conversation titled Rethinking Building Craft as an Urban Catalyst. Welcome to the speakers and welcome to the organizing team who you can see on the screen. The group of students from Algonquin College, Lisa Chiasson, Haley Sterling, Alicia Bedard, Lexi Lord, Victoria Davis, and Alara Soros. My name is Pallavi Swaranjali, and I will be moderating the session. And we will be having two presentations back to back with our speakers for around 20 minutes, 25 minutes each, followed by a conversation between them, and then a question answer session after. If you feel like asking a question, we will be delighted. Please put that into the chat window here. If you're watching us on YouTube, there is a chat window there, and you can post your questions there. We will be following it and we will be bringing it into our webinar. So our first speaker today is Shannon Bassett, and I would invite Alora to introduce Shannon.
Hi everyone. So Shannon Bassett is a Canadian-American architectural and urban designer. Her research, teaching, writing, and practice operate at the intersections of architecture, urban design, and landscape ecology. Her writing on both China's explosive urbanization and its changing landscape, as well as shrinking cities and the post-industrial landscape in North America, have been published in Topos, Urban Flux, Landscape Architecture Frontiers magazine, and Canadian Architect. Her design work and research has been exhibited both nationally as well as internationally, including at the Hong Kong Sichuan Bi-City Biennial of Urbanism and Architecture in 2012, and was featured in the ensuing book publication, Learning from Tricyclical Cities, The Time, the Place, the People, published by Oro Editions. Her work has also been displayed at the Bugake International Architectural Exhibit, and she's been awarded a National Endowment for the Arts grant for Restitch Tampa. Ensuing for this research platform was the publication Restitch Tampa, Designing the Post-War Coastal American City Through Ecologies, published by Akhtar. So here we have Shannon Bassett.
Okay, thank you so much for that wonderfully extensive introduction, and thank you so much to Pallavi for hosting this amazing series of mindful conversations, as well as Algonquin. Okay, so I'm just going to quickly share my screen. Okay, so as was mentioned, my research and teaching practice has been for over 20 years, really operating at the intersection of architecture, urbanism, and ecologies. And so today I'm going to talk about what I'm currently doing in Sudbury at the MacEwan School of Architecture at Laurentian University. And I will pair that with a project I'm currently very excitedly collaborating with the Delhi School of Planning and Architecture. And I believe my colleague Anuradha Chaturvedi is in the audience as well. So the topic is rethinking building craft as an urban catalyst. And again, my research and teaching and service have really operated at the intersections of architecture, landscape, ecology, and urbanism. So the kind of prompting for this, I mean, I did an undergraduate of architecture actually at Carleton here in Ottawa. And then I was always very interested in kind of the larger agency I might have as an architect within a larger scope of the city. And so after 5 years of working in Boston in practice, I did go back to school and study urban design at the Harvard Graduate School of Design. And one of the last studios that I did there was in the spring of 2005. It was run by Jean Bousquet, the Spanish urban designer, and it was in New Orleans. And so this was right before Hurricane Katrina, which happened in August of 2005. And it really, of course, with that catastrophe, it really exasperated the kinds of unintended consequences we might have had from a kind of gray man-made infrastructural systems for city design versus ecological systems, or a more hybrid mentality, as people like the Dutch do, who are constantly living under the mean sea level, but have worked at a kind of hybrid, if you will, between nature and man-made infrastructure. So this was the ensuing publication that came from that studio, the New Orleans Strategies for a City in a Soft Land. And in fact, my partner and I, when we visited the city, we did a series of mappings. So the lenses that we looked at the city of New Orleans through was that of topography and land use. And of course, this is a pretty seminal image now done by the Army Corps of Engineer Harold Fisk, and this is showing an alluvial map of the lower Mississippi Valley. And in fact, it's the Mississippi River, but it shows over a series, I think 100 years, the changing of its course, but it's superimposed, so you see the change. And of course, this was when the river was allowed to naturally kind of run its course. And by doing so, actually, the sedimentation was able to kind of pile up on land and make land. And so, of course, when they did rationalize, through pumping systems and modernization of the city in the 1910s, with the introduction of a pumping system, the introduction of speculative, nefarious, sometimes land practices where they drained the swamp, and they put a lot of what we found in these series of mappings, a correlation between really poor, marginalized communities and their level below sea level or below the water level. So again, this kind of real interest or passion in ecological urbanism strategies prompted me to apply for and be granted a grant from the National Endowment for the Arts to run an international design competition. So this was, I was teaching in Tampa, which is in the southern US, obviously, and on a very precarious kind of geographical landscape site in terms of it, being really susceptible to sea level rise and climate change. And also, again, like I noticed when, moving there, that there was a real disconnect between the natural systems of the city and, the river. And so the competition really was prompted, or it visioned a kind of three-pronged approach layered between ecology, connectivity, and infrastructures, and the programs that could be imbued for that. And really asked, it was initially supposed to be with the announcement in 2010 of the Obama administration, then the first high-speed rail to be put in the United States, which would run between Orlando and Tampa. And so with a lot of Tea Party politics, unfortunately, that was squashed. And so I had to shift the thinking of the competition and really, again, kind of visualized it through connective green infrastructures. At the kind of post-industrial landscape here in Ottawa, I was also researching and did a studio on a brownfield site, but this was featured, the research for this, in an article featured by Canadian architect under Systems of Sustainability and Cultural Landscapes. And so this is, for those who are in Ottawa or know, it's a very charged site. It's La Chaudière site. It is an island in the middle of the Ottawa River between predominantly French-speaking Quebec and English-speaking Ontario. And it's also a very significant site for First Nations people because of, you see here the power dam, but in fact the sacred nature of the Chaudière site itself. And so kind of through the ensuing settlement that happened with European settlers and the prominence of the wood industry, this was turned into first the E.B. Eddy match factory, and then a pulp and paper mill factory, which the Domtar, which made this, this power ring dam, in fact, in 1910 as well. And so the kind of prompting for the article and then the ensuing studio, and now actually there's a development there called ZB, was the idea that, how could you begin to remediate or recover the landscape of the site at once, and as well as look at the kind of cultural artifacts, if you will, and the relics, which were predominantly post-industrial, as well as the very sacred nature of the indigenous peoples. So these are just looking at some relics, if you will, of the site. And so this, again, the studio was framed through the layers of landscape, infrastructure, as well as architecture. And so these were a series, again, of the proposals that came out of this urban design studio, which I taught in 2013, which looked at development, recovering the industrial artifacts at the same time as recovering, like through open space systems and relationships to water, more productive landscapes at the same time as a kind of placemaking, working with the indigenous peoples. So this takes me to what I'm currently working on in Sudbury, teaching at the MacEwan School of Architecture. So it's the newest school of architecture in Canada in over 40 years. It has a tricultural mandate. The two official languages which are taught in are both English and French. And there is an Indigenous perspective in terms of teachings and pedagogies within the curriculum. So this is a studio which I have taught in as well as coordinated in the fall of 2019. And some of the topics I'm going to be talking about this week, actually, at the Council of Landscape Architects Educators. So grounding and integrating Indigenous land-based learning into the architectural curriculum. So this is the second year of the undergraduate, and we do have on staff an Indigenous elder who's art pedagogus, who is featured here, as well as a knowledge carrier, Julia Padamagabau. And so for this studio, I mean, we really take students, or we did before the pandemic, out into the landscape, and they learn from the landscape. And so and this is kind of in conflict, if you will, or contrast to what has become a very extractive landscape historically in Sudbury. When they were putting the railway in, they discovered nickel, which kind of catalyzed a very extractive based approach to the landscape. This is the super stack from the former Inco. There was a lot of smelting that happened. And of course, these are featured. These are from Edward Bertinsky's Urban Mines Nickel Tailings series that look at the impact that extractive landscape had, or extracted mentality, I suppose, or industry had on our landscape. So actually a lot of what we do talk about in the studio, in addition to working with our Indigenous elder, we do meet with scientists from the Living with Lake Center, ecologists who were really key in the massive regreening strategy that started or took place in the 1970s with the rise of a kind of environmental consciousness as spurred by, Rachel Carson's Silent Spring, where we started to, really consider the impact on our environment and take measures and steps towards it. So, again, this is framing the studio. And so we did, we took our students out into the landscape as a kind of land-based learning and site reconnaissance. These are images of the students on our second site, which was for a sauna. Sudbury is also located on the Canadian Shield. So a lot of the kind of materiality, if you will, that we are faced with is this kind of outcropping. This is our master lecturer, Adladia Smoke, who started this project, working with, again, our Indigenous elder, art pedagogus, who is here, as well as Joey Lynn Wabi, who works with in the Indigenous Relations School at Laurentian University. And so the students really learn firsthand from going out and harvesting materials. This is the birch bark that you saw, which was being stripped, and the trees aren't hurt by that. And then the strips of birch are dried for a series of months. And then they were cut into 3-foot square shingles, or what would be shingles. This is us on the loading dock at the School of Architecture and Art as well. And then through a series of knowledge dissemination, I suppose, from our Indigenous knowledge carrier, Julia, with her daughter here, the students are taught, how to sew and to stitch like jute with cedar shims to the birch bark. This is Julia here in 2019 showing the students. We did harvest spruce gum from the trees as part of our learnings in the landscape. And so this is the tender flake is actually replacing the bear fat, which would be typically used. The students, this is Julia's daughter, who again is showing us how to clarify the sap, if you will, which becomes a pliable, natural-based caulking for the shingles. So these are, again, students learning or stitching various different ways of stitching and sewing the jute, which, creates a kind of structural integrity, if you will. And then we, in fact, this was part of a kind of cumulative over a series of years, the Bentwood structure, which is currently at the Laurentian main campus in Founders Square, which again, Aladia began with Joey Lynn Wabi. And so kind of consecutive second year studios have continued to add to this in cladding. This is one of our Indigenous students as well, kind of, sharing her, I think kind of the fact that she does take pride in her identity and project, and that as an Indigenous student, as she is quoted, she really has a sense of pride when she was walking through the studios and seeing students struggling with their work and, really telling them that the birch bark is an animate material, and while working on it, that they should treat it like their grandmothers. And another student who is not, this is Grace, what Rebecca said, of that experience, it was really good to be in another environment other than school. And when they were outside kind of harvesting the spruce gum, it was nice to see their peers out in nature. So these are the shingles in the studio. And then there's the design build again, where students are learning through traditional oral-based knowledge or imparting of sacred knowledge from our elder, how to stitch and affix this natural shingle to the bentwood structure. The Indigenous knowledge keepers stated that they could have, don't want to use the word ornamentation, but that they could have images on the birch bark themselves that they felt was specific to their own culture. So I think Joey Lynn Wabi, in fact, used crushed berries, and students experienced with kind of the imprint on the material or on the birch bark itself, which is featured here. One of my students, Grace, was, we learned about obviously the cosmology of the direction of the wigwam and even larger passive design strategies as situated in a campus. And various kinds of detailing. So she actually did a flap which opened up for the window. So again, here we're learning, the different, even the tools and the natural owls that, you could pierce the birch bark with, which was a learning experience in itself as architecture students. And then maybe just finally, this was the second, the main architectural project of the studio was to design a sauna for Bennett Lake. And so we continue to have this discourse in the studio, how do we take the teachings and the learnings from working with an Indigenous land-based approach and harvesting natural materials and take that as a hybrid approach into, our architectural projects, quote, that need to meet code, that, have, certain requirements. And so this was Rebecca Jacobs' sauna, and in fact, is the de facto that we go to stick frame construction, which is milled, or again, do we continue to kind of evolve and learn from the craft? So this is the second project it's more speculative, it's not speculative, but it's currently in the works, if you will. And so I just wanted to also preface this, maybe the students are interested in my trajectory of introduction to India. This is me, obviously a lot younger, in the late 90s. And this was an initiative of the RAAC, the Royal Architecture Institute of Canada, and CEDA at the time, the Canadian International Development Agency, which has changed names. And so this was actually a follow-up to a program that had a group of students went to Ladakh, northern India, and I believe did a project for a nunnery there. And so this was a student that had taken part in that and ended up building a school there. And so that was when I first traveled to India. And, in Ladakh, this was a fairly seminal book at that time, which I think is, arguably been critiqued to a certain extent by Helen and Norberg Hodge, Ancient Futures. And again, the idea that you learn from the kind of traditional oral, transmitted craft, and then you continue to work with that, as opposed to an absolute modernization. And in this case, it was really critiquing the kind of globalization that had happened in Leh and Ladakh at that time, in the late 90s, whereas I even understand from my collaborator Anu that is even more kind of globalized. And so, I ended up doing my undergraduate thesis at Carleton on the Adalaj stepwell, which is in Gujarat in the West. I had the privilege, I guess, of spending a month in Louis Kahn's Indian Institute of Management in the ladies' dorms. And then I also spent about a week in Adalaj, which was the small village about an hour outside, which I commuted on the back of someone's motorbike, I remember, no helmet, to document and really, be part of that village. And so these are a series of like drawings and documentations that I did, and is also very interested in the kind of gender role, if you will, of, how the role, and I think one of our speakers in a previous panel actually discussed very eloquently, the role of these not as objects within the village, but in fact, the lifeline, and in fact, is part of, a larger kind of interconnected ecological performative system that I think, he said those even part of like the caravan route that extended as far as Iran. And so I also architecturally was very interested in how, it at once kind of occupied the sacred and the profane, if you will, of like but at the same time as being these prominent spaces within the communities for the women who would use them as temples, but also use them to clean the clothes and to bathe and wash. And of course, there's this prominent, I guess, edge condition in many, and this is, of course, Varanasi, which, of course, occupies an edge along the holy Ganges River. So this brings me very quickly, and I will wrap up, to my current research project and teaching project with my colleagues who are at the School of Planning and Architecture in Delhi. It's in Shahjahanabad, which is the old walled city of Delhi in India. And this is actually an urban and community design studio that I will be teaching this September at the McEwen School of Architecture in collaboration with the SBA. And so this is looking at a kind of Google Earth. You can see the absolute density of this. And it's the research project is focused on the physical research and study of Shahjahanabad as the old walled city of India. And just a kind of background, the area is designated as a special area per the 2020-21 Delhi Master Plan. It is located in central Delhi and at the core of the city's present urban agglomeration. And so we will really be conducting in-country field research. We have identified 5 zones, which will be kind of priority interventions within the study area that really represent a kind of spectrum or a range of architectural and urban typologies. So, and this is Anu, sorry, Anu, but this was actually when I was in India last December 2020, 2019, before the pandemic. And so this was, we did a series of site reconnaissances, and we climbed, very scarily for me, but not for Anu, we climbed on top of a roof and looked out over, Shahjahanabad, and you can kind of see the pressures of urbanization. It looks like there's a lot of kind of infrastructural, systems putting in. And then this, of course, is looking out on the other side of, some of a very cultural significant site of the mosque. And so, we did this kind of site reconnaissance in a rickshaw, and again, you can kind of see the the presence of a lot of these exposed kind of electrical conduits, a lot of the the signage, the new signage that is put in. And so maybe to tie into Kavita's presentation, these are actually very interesting typologically, because it's kind of like an arcade, which creates an interesting interstitial space between the public realm and the kind of shops and the housing above. And so I actually put this in, and this is a credit to Smita, who is also a collaborator from some of her images. And so they have, been doing for a long time adaptive reuse in Shajanabad. And, so again, these are accredited to the SBA in terms of like, their mappings, they're looking at historical references. Again, you can kind of see the density of this. And, very interestingly, when it was first implemented, the city, it had by the Mughal emperor, and it was moved from Agra. It was very sophisticated in terms of its ecological systems and urbanism at a series of nested scales, its relationship to the Yamuna River, in terms of like its ecological urbanism strategy, and even at the nested scale of the Havelis themselves and the courtyards, in terms of passive design strategies, kind of cooling and orientation. And so, as you can see, a lot of the issues is the kind of, urban degradation, if you will, that has happened over time. So again, this is going to be really framing, I would say, how we approach the studio in terms of, looking at it and mapping it through a series of nested scales of understanding. And this is Smita. And so one of the other things that is part of the research, as well as the studio, as a series of community engaged meetings and engagement. And so, the kind of other caveat to this, which I didn't really touch upon very much, the pandemic. And so just with the studio that we did, the second semester we just finished in December, of course, everything was remote teaching. So there was this kind of interesting aspect that, our Indigenous elder kind of transmitted a lot of what were previously oral knowledge and craft and sacred craft into a digital format, simply to teach our students, right? So there was that aspect of it. And of course, we had to do more of a virtual or remote cladding of the wigwam. And we also had, sent out students birch bark, so that they could at least understand the materiality of it and explore, experiment, with the material, this animate object, in terms of like stitching or sewing, or dippling, or, doing, ornament or their own ornamentation specific or important to their own cultural histories. And so, one of the things, I guess, just finally to end off with, and maybe this could be an interesting part of discussion, so we've been talking about how will we do action-oriented research remotely. So, we continue to explore the importance of participatory process in Shajanabad over its urban history, which again has really created a unique urban model there, which really has supported and encouraged informal and flexible insertions into the urban fabric. And so we're deriving a series of, I guess, we're identifying a series of public spaces within Shajanabad and zones of intervention. We will be working with local stakeholders, along with decision makers and elected representatives, and also we will be, seeking collaboration with heritage specialists for the development of an economically viable and implementable participatory model for kind of the upgradation and through architectural and urban interventions. So again, we are discussing in the studio what appropriate kind of ecological and cultural landscape planning strategies that also meet the contemporary needs of the diverse communities within the settlement. And so there is a synergy that exists between stakeholders and a common recognition of the need for a more research and evidence-based development vision for sustainable future of the historic walls in the city. So again, as part of these 5 zones, just to go back to what we'll be doing in the studio in September, probably remotely. It could happen, kind of physically, but we have planned for kind of virtual site reconnaissance through drones and photogrammetry, and also much more innovative ways of participatory design with communities. And we will be creating a blog and a website where we will be disseminating the information. In addition, we plan on having a series of kind of symposiums and publications that follow up from the studio, which will happen for the next 2 years. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Shannon. That was a very nice presentation and brings forth so many aspects and such a complexity, right? This kind of ecological thinking that you're promoting.
It's 8 o'clock.
Oh, sorry. Was that your alarm? So this whole ecological sensitivity that probably you're promoting through your studios and through your work, I think is amazing. And Kavita's presentation, I think, will also bring in certain aspects which are common to both of you. And I really like the last slide that you brought in, which will open up our conversation part, right? This idea of the dissemination of such a knowledge that you're talking about, and the scales that you bring in, right? From the craft to almost to the urban city planning level, and how they interact with each other, I think will be a very amazing conversation. So looking forward to that. And thank you for your wonderful presentation. I would now ask Lexi to introduce our next speaker, please.
Hi, everyone. So Kavita Jain is a practicing conservation architect and dean within the Faculty of Architecture and Planning at the Vivekananda Global University, Jaipur. And she completed her bachelor in architecture from the Malavia National Institute of Technology, MNIT, in Jaipur, and a postgraduate in architectural conservation from the School of Planning and Architecture in New Delhi. She's been running an award-winning practice in the field of architecture and heritage conservation for the last 21 years. And some of her notable accomplishments include winning the prestigious NDTV Grow Award for Adaptive Reuse in Historical Buildings in 2015, as well as being featured in various documentary films within historical building and temple-based TV channels. Kavita has been a consultant for Asian Development Bank, World Bank, and the World Monument Fund for various projects in the heritage sector. Her expertise lies in working with traditional construction processes and materials as she conducts workshops, training programs, and heritage walks for students, teachers, architects, and craftsmen. Please welcome Kavita Jain.
Thank you, Lexi. Oh, very good morning to all of you, and good evening to some of you. Can you see my screen?
Yes, Kavita.
Okay. So today we are going to discuss the rethinking building craft as an urban catalyst. So what kind of craft are we talking about? And what kind of buildings are we talking about? We are talking about the heritage buildings or traditional craft. And why heritage building or traditional craft? Because the traditional neighborhood or traditional buildings, what we observe today, is not a result of just one-time effort, but it's an outcome of hundreds of years of understanding and working with nature and environment. So we can say the history tells us about the design principles of an architecture of a region. So we can also call architecture is an outcome of interaction between man and nature and a culmination of geography, geology, religion, social customs, history of a region, and climate. So here I would be more focusing on the aspects which is the climate, and with case studies of Rajasthan or Jaipur. Briefly speaking, India has 6 climate zones, and Rajasthan comes under the hot and dry climate. And if I talk about the Jaipur's temperature is relatively very high throughout the year. And during the summers, the average temperature is about 30 degrees centigrade. And in winters, the average temperature is about 15 to 18 degrees centigrade. And winds are usually local. The winds are hot in the summers and they carry dust, sand, and often develop into these dust storms. And because of this temperature and wind, the vegetation is very sparse here. And it's also difficult to maintain because of the lack of the rain and low humidity, and soils dry quickly after rains. And the rainfall is also very less. It's almost 650 millimeters on average. And in summers, there are dust storms and dust raising winds prevailing, and wind speed reaches to almost 10 kilometers per hour. So considering all these climatic features, these solar passive techniques are adopted. I specifically talking about the buildings in Jaipur in context of Jaipur. So buildings here adopted solar passive techniques and also adopted the natural ventilation system, and which led to thermal comfort. And the general arrangement of traditional neighborhood are the compact planning, or we can also call it a dense clustering of buildings and street pattern, houses arranged around courtyards in dry climate zones. Orientation was considered, and orientation as a placement is done so as to minimize the sun exposure in summers, and provision of shades for maximum sun protection in summers, and also designed the shading devices so as to get maximum heat in winters. And there are provision for ventilation, for regulation of air movements. Orientation of building is done in such a way so that we have the minimum facade towards the west side. The larger building dimension were kept towards the north and south side. And wind orientation were considered. Accordingly, the buildings were oriented so as to get maximum wind during the summers, or in between time between the summers and winters. And interiors were also planned on the concept of deep room arrangements so as to have cooling contrast between indoor and outdoor spaces. So components of building envelope are the key determinants of the amount of heat gain or loss and wind that enters inside the buildings. So those primary components are walls, roof, and fenestration. In any historical building, all these components were well thought and designed properly so as to reduce the heat gain. So roofs are generally, you can see here in these pictures, these are some of the buildings from Jaipur city. You can see here the main city gates towards the city and major streets, and many residential mansions on either side of these streets. Here, this is the image of a city palace, where we can see the provision of flat roofs, which is a good reflector and re-radiates heat, and high parapet solid walls along the edge of the roof so as to minimize the heat gain on the roof. And also the principle is involved to catch an unobstructed breeze at high level and to channel it to areas in the bottom parts of the building. So roofs were considered properly, and walls having the stone masonry and lime mortar, and the walls were very thick to create a time lag between outside and inside temperatures. Materials used were having high thermal capacity and low conductivity. Mainly those materials were sandstones, limestones, and quartzite stones for the masonry. Sandstones are very climate friendly material, and it's not a good insulator but also a poor conductor, because as soon as the sunlight falls on the sandstone, it reflects. And limestone is used for doing araish ditto, lime plaster works, lime concrete work on the roof, and making fenestrations, which we call a lime jali. And stones used in masonry allow to keep temperature lower inside the building and helps in creating time lag due to high thermal capacities. So these buildings have the important traditional elements like gates, bastions, enclosure walls, courtyards, chhatris. Chhatri, I mean to say the pavilions, and tabaris, which have the 3 arched openings. So these traditional buildings had these kind of elements. columns, arches, openings, and parapets. So you can see few images of these traditional building elements. These are the gates having the pavilion on top of that, and bastions and enclosure wall of the Jaipur city and Amer town, and few more monuments. This is example of Albert Hall having pavilions at various levels and columns, arches, which makes it more elaborate and gives a unique aesthetic feature to the building. And here in this building, we can see architectural elements like openings and parapet. And also these elements were used considering the type of the building. The element itself suggests that this must be an office building. This is the old assembly building of Jaipur. And this building is one of the residential building. So elements were used very thoughtfully. Here in this image, we can see how these elements were used so as to provide aesthetic appearance and also provide the thermal comfort, like high parapet walls, pavilions on top of that, crenellations, like that. And the courtyards were also considered while planning according to the thermal comfort. So here we can see the courtyards at various levels. So this building is planned on the concept of courtyards. And these building elements consist building craft, which I'm going to talk about in detail. So these crafts were also having two purposes mainly. One is the climatic reason, and other is the aesthetic purpose, or those were put according to the architectural principles. Like if building is temple, then pavilions or pinnacles on top of those pavilion will be used. And for the climatic reasons, we have the like fenestrations and other elements. So some of the building crafts are stone pinnacles, crenellations, or we call it kangura, fenestrations or lattices or screens or jali, stone railings, brackets, mirror or thikri work we call it, and ornamental arches, moldings, columns in lime plaster, and araish finish. So these are some of the building crafts. So here in this image, in just these two images, you can see most of the building craft. Like here, this is the pinnacle, but this is made here in metal. And you can see the ornamental lime work, or we also call it a stucco work on top of this roof, and ornamental lime plaster work, moldings, fenestrations, and finish in araish dedo. And this is the crenellations on top of the parapet wall. And here you can see the screens or jalis as a building craft. And as I said, the architecture also represent the region or history of the region, or geology and geography. So jalis were made in most of the states of India. And depending upon the material availability, the material was used. Like in Rajasthan, jalis are made using stones and lime mortar. Whereas if you go to the central part of the India, which is the Madhya Pradesh, Uttar Pradesh, you'll find jalis and bricks. And in western part or northeastern part of the India, you'll find those screens or fenestrations and even in wood. So depending upon the availability of local material, these fenestrations were made. Similarly, the other building craft is the mirror work, which we call it thikri. So here in one of the palace in Jaipur, you can see how the mirror work was done. And it was very well integrated with this stucco work and the araish work. So some more images of the mirror work. Here the mirror work is applied in one of the niches just to make surfaces more elaborate. It again depending upon for whom the building is constructed, and that accordingly the buildings were elaborated or aesthetically treated. And some more finish is araish finish. This is again one of the building craft, and sometimes we call it a fresco work. When it is done simply just in two colors, we call it araish, or when it is done very intricately and use lots of colors, it's called frescoes. And here also in this technique, earlier our people used the local material and natural pigments like stones or vegetable colors. Few more images showing Araish work done on the stucco plaster work. One more image of showing the Araish work along with the other building craft like arches and columns and moldings, ornamental moldings. Here also we can see a combination of stucco, Araish, and moldings. So I come to the most important building craft, that is jali. We also call it lattice work, also call it a screen. We also call it fenestration. It has reputed place in traditional decorative techniques. And it was not only for providing the air and light, but also plays an important role to increase the beauty of the buildings, and which can easily make out by looking all on those facades. The lattices were made in different sizes, thicknesses, and designs. And usually, holes in these lattices were made in different types of geometric figures, like circular, or square, rectangular, star shaped. Because these jalis were made during the Mughal period, during Islamic period, during Rajput period. So based on its time period, sometimes design changed. Like in Mughal period, we have more geometrical pattern, whereas in Rajput period, we were having in flower motifs or in circular patterns. And sometimes colored glasses were also fixed in jalis. So jali helps in lowering the temperature by compressing the air through the holes. And when the air passes through these openings, its velocity increases, giving profound diffusion. And it has been also observed that humid areas have larger holes with overall lower capacity opacity than compared with the dry climatic regions of Gujarat and Rajasthan. Because in humid areas, we need more air circulation in the interiors of these spaces. So the holes, the sizes of the holes varies according to region. And with compactness of the residential buildings in modern Jali became less frequent for privacy and security matters as far as the limitation and constraints are concerned. So the security matters also comes into picture. So traditionally, if we talk about the purpose, so first purpose was to fill the large openings so as to let air and sunlight in, and to block the direct sun rays, and but at the same time permitting the cross ventilation. So through these holes we have the air and light inside the areas, but also obstructing some direct light into the interior spaces, and also to provide privacy to the family members, especially to the ladies of the house in old times, because in earlier times there was a more they were more concerned about the privacy of females, so that females could see outside area, but outside people should not see into the interior spaces. So those jalis actually fulfilled the purpose. At time, these jalis also had a built-in shuttered openings for viewing. So these are the built-in wooden shutters for viewing purposes. So some more screens, so as to serve as just a screen in the opening, or sometimes as a parapet wall, or sometimes as a railing on top of the roof. And here in this picture, you can see the lime jali provided in the openings in a design that reduces the wind speed and keeps inside temperature cool. And here the section is inclined. It is quite visible that these lime mortar sections are inclined, so that the visibility is obstructed from the outside. By this picture, it can be clearly understood. This is picture of a screen from outside, and this is a picture of the screen from the inside. From inside, you can see the inclined jalis are created so as to person can see towards the street side view, and from the outside nothing is visible towards the inside. So this is how it was made, and it's not possible with a machine. It was only possible with the hands. With actually human could only make it with using his hands. And jalis were also designed according to the overall facade, and it was integrated with other elements of the facade like ornamental plaster work, and integrated with the openings or ventilators. Here in this picture, we can see how these jalis were integrated with the ornamental plasterwork. It's a part of this niche. And here it is provided on top of the arch. Here also it's part of this ornamental plasterwork. So this is how it was well integrated in the facades of exterior surfaces and interior surfaces. Here we can see this jali is integrated with the projected balcony. This is a view from the inside. So how the projected balcony is provided with these jalis, and here it's just put on top of the window opening, and mostly it was put on the higher level so that because we know the hot air rises up, so whenever hot air in the room will go at upper level, it will just go out through these ventilators, and the inside temperature would be cooler. Here, the jali is integrated again along with the ornamental plasterwork. Here, it's a part of the ventilator and put on top of the door opening. And in some of the mosques, the jali is made using stone. It's a tree of life symbol, and the jali was made in the stone. So the use, purposes, and the concept behind the jali we can better understand with this example. This is a Hawa Mahal in Jaipur, and it's also called as a wind palace or palace of winds, because the person inside the palace can actually feel the cool breezes which blows through these openings, through these jalis. If we see the closer views of these openings, we'll find that opening positioned at the upper level of the walls. Basically, the purpose was the same as already explained, that these are given on the east side so as to capture the prevailing wind all year around, and especially in summer where the prevailing wind pattern is east to southeast. And all the main rooms are oriented towards the north side with small openings, because climate was considered predominantly in designing the overall building, and even in laying out the each and every room. So which dimension should, which side should face what direction, it was well thought of. So fenestration configuration in Hawa Mahal represents the principles applicable in hot dry climate. That is, windows needs to be appropriately shaded, encourage airflow and natural ventilation, and they should have a small area. So here you can see the picture of one of the projected window from the outer side. So here you can see the how the openings were designed. At in the same opening, the one side we have the shuttered opening, and on the upper level we have these jali or fenestration. And the window towards the major streets are designed, or the outer outer side are designed in such a manner that it is larger on the external side. We can see here, like this dimension is larger than this dimension. So external dimensions are larger than the internal side, by providing tapering walls, so that when the hot end enters through it, the temperature reduces and the pressure also decreases. And when temperature reduces, the wind speed increases. And this is how the internal spaces are kept cool. So this phenomena is also known as the Bernoulli's Venturi effect. We can understand this effect by this diagram. So this is the Venturi effect when we have the larger dimension of wall on this side, whereas the opening size is very small. So speed of wind increases when it funnels through the small openings. And this is again uncomfortable for pedestrian, but an excellent way to disperse pollutants. So the severity of the Venturi effect is a function of width, length, height, and size of the opening in the canyon. The thermal mass captures the heat, plus allowing the cold air currents. And at the same times, the jalis were, or these fenestrations were provided with a colored glass, because at the same time, the aesthetics were also considered. On exterior side, at some places, the glass are fixed where we don't want to have wind inside, and only the jalis are provided where we want breezes or wind inside these spaces, and can make out with this image the same kind of design, but here no glass is fixed, only the lime mortar screens are made in the openings, so which allow view towards the outside and enhance ventilation inside the building through their position and shape. So jalis are set at an angle maximizing wind flow according to Bernoulli's Venturi principle, which I already explained. And here you can see a facade is facing east side. So these openings also face the south, east, southeast, or east, northeast sides to capture maximum wind inside these spaces. And the same openings towards the interior side. And we can here also understand the reduction of the wind speed, and the temperature cool inside, and queens can look outside through these openings. So to promote this important element, important craft, we are actually conducting workshops for the architects, designers, students, and teach them the importance and usage of this jali, how to make this jali, and what are those techniques behind these jalis. And sometimes the workshops are conducted for the junior craftspeople, also for the new masons. And here in this picture we can see they are actually drawing the designs of jali and understanding it, so as they are able to make on the panel. Here a few more pictures of workshops for the students of architecture and design. And then those craftsmen, or those who got experienced in making these, they are being actually used at site work. So they are now part of the restoration work, and they are making these fenestrations at the site. So if I talk about the materials used, the materials are always used locally available. And because these buildings are very sustainable buildings, they used all locally available material. Lime is mostly available. So lime, it was used in form of limestone, which was baked properly. And this baked limestone was then slaked in water for several days, let's say for 15 days. And once the putty is prepared, it was mixed with the burnt brick powder, which we called it surkhi locally in Hindi. Otherwise, it's a burnt brick powder. So the lime, putty, and burnt brick powder is mixed together to make the mortar, along with the ingredients like gum, which we call it google, and jaggery, to increase its binding strength and to also avoid the shrinkage cracks. So here in this images, we can actually understand the making of lime jali. Here on one side, we have this burnt brick powder, which is seeped through. Here we have the lime putty. Both putty and surki is added together to make this mortar. And once the mortar is ready, so we actually prepare a base for making lime panels. So here, this is just a base for making these panels, and it's prepared in almost 1 inches thickness. It is beaten for several days for bamboo sticks so as to prevent cracks development in plaster. And once this process is completed, in which takes around 5 to 6 days, these panels are ready for making the drawings. You can see here the lime mortar panels. And then the drawing is drawn with the help of thread and color. Nowadays, we make drawings using our AutoCAD or we use scales, but traditional craftsmen, they were using only the thread and colors, and they were having in mind certain proportion. And with the help of that proportions, they could actually able to draw it on the lime panels. And once the drawing is drawn, it is cut using a particular tool, a metal tool, which we call it the Burmi kalam. And kalam is basically a tool which is used to cut the pattern in the lime mortar panels. And after cutting of the lattice, curing is done. Here the cutting is done. Then it is cured for several days so as to get strength. Because lime mortar takes time for setting. It's unlike cement, which sets just in a few hours. It takes days to set. So once it is set, then it is lifted up and fixed it at the appropriate place. Here are some more images of making of it. And here you can see it's cut and made and cured. And this is how the actual drawing is drawn. By using simple triangle as a basic shape, there are almost more than 600 design possibilities. We can make more than 600 designs by using just a triangle as a basic geometrical shape. So you can see what is the basic shapes, the star shape or hexagon, the small hexagon and the bigger hexagon in the same pattern. And by using these three basic elements, we can create several designs. Here, by using the star and this hexagon, which is further divided into 6 parts, we can create this kind of design. So here, some more design using square as a basic shape. So this is an octagonal jali using the square as a basic shape. Because these techniques we actually learned from craftsmen only. They told like what proportion are to be used, like 4 part and 7 part. And then you join all lines, you'll automatically get this kind of design, and then you can draw anything out of your mind. So again, using the basic elements, this pattern is created. And this is then developed into this shape. This can be developed into this design and this design, this design. And you can see actually the line panel using those designs. This is how it is cut and prepared. And here we can see how it can be used even in contemporary buildings. So it's being used in building which was constructed in metal and glass. So at upper level, the screen is created using these fenestrations. And some more implications in contemporary buildings. And similarly, the other building craft is Araish, which I can briefly explain. Like Araish is actually a fine, smooth finish used to done on interiors, on exteriors of these surfaces. Sometimes it gives the marble-like impact. You can actually see your reflection into the surfaces. It is such a smooth and fine finish work. And to actually motivate our new generations and to teach our designers and architects, the workshops are conducted to make them understand the making of the Araish also. So for the purpose of teaching them, we have worked on these lime panels. Otherwise, this Araish is directly applied on the walls. But unless until they learn how to apply on lime plaster surfaces, it won't be possible for them to directly work on the walls. So first they are working on the panels, and then they can work on the walls. So these are some of the panels made by the students or young designers using the natural pigments, the stone colors, vegetable colors, and they made design out of their minds. Otherwise, we have several conventional designs as well, but all those developed by the student itself. The other building craft is mirror work. So mirror work is also applied on historical buildings to make it more aesthetically appealing or to give it a very rich look. So the mirror work was done. So this technique is also being taught to students and new craftsmen, and some designs are made by the architects, some more designs. And here you can see the contemporary implication of mirror work, which can be used in the contemporary building. So this is how our important building craft is being promoted and trying to continue or so that this craft is being used and not die actually, because we don't have many craftsmen working in this field. So we feel that this is our responsibility to teach and to not let die our age-old traditional techniques. Thank you.
Thank you, Kavita, and such beautiful, inspiring images there. And just looking at them makes us happy. So, inhabiting the place, or even making getting involved in the craft itself would be so joyous for people who you're reaching out to. Wonderful. Thank you for that wonderful presentation. And yes, I do agree about the craft. You're talking about a scale, the level of the jolly, but it also reflects so many social, cultural norms, the climatic conditions, and how the people at that time were countering those climatic conditions through these crafts. And the idea that you're promoting about preservation of these crafts is, I think, so important and critical at this stage. But at this point, I would invite Shannon as well as you to talk a little bit about each other's work and what you feel about the different scales that you're talking about, the dissemination and preservation of those.
I can start. I was really such beautiful work that Kavita was showing. And I was also just really struck as she was speaking, again, maybe, from the perspective as an architect and an urban designer, at the really, sophisticated scales or nested, scales of these jalis, and as well as, I mentioned with Shahjahanabad, looking back at the initial Mughal, design for the city, and how sophisticated was in terms of the nested scales of ecological systems. Just rethinking how, at once these are beautiful jalis, they have layered performative ecologies, in terms of the climate. They talk about the local, materials and craftspeople. Just as an aside, when I was in India in 2019, because I was giving a speech or a talk at the Bhopal School of Architecture, School of Planning and Architecture, I had the chance to visit the Indira Gandhi Women's Folk Art, I think, museum, which is kind of an amazing open air museum in a forest. And I was really struck. I was looking at so they have these kinds of, I suppose, installations, you can call them, like tiny houses. And there was one with the jali, and you could see the thumbprint in them, right? Because I think they were terracotta. And it was just so amazing, like, to think that these are made by hand, right? And there's almost like this divorcing that has happened, through modernization or international architecture, like through the standardization of, production, that we've lost the sense that these are made by hand or were made by hand. And so just to kind of circle back, at once these jalis, again, talk about relationship, like performing passive design functions to the climate. And at once, they're performing they're talking about their architectural programs, because I'm familiar with the jalis in mosque design, right? Where you want to, you separate the men and the women programmatically, and, you see glimpses of them, right? So you were talking about that. But also at the scale of the urban design. So like if, and we talked about Shahjahanabad wanting to have a kind of consistent like urban street facade, right, that they used to have, that when you aggregate these jalis together, they're performing at an urban scale in terms of a very sustainable city, in terms of like natural cooling and ventilation, capturing of wind, so these are all things that we're talking about today in terms of like low impact design communities, like, and how at once these buildings on their own can actually work performatively across, an urban scale. So I was so struck by that. And again, just thinking about what we have lost and how we can begin to work, as we were talking about, I think, when we were preparing this, with our local craftspeople, and not lose that knowledge, And we were talking about almost the silver lining, right, in the pandemic. And now, if it's when we were working with our Indigenous elder, or as I didn't really talk about this much in the Shajanabad, but, we're discussing the fact that now, like Smita, one of my collaborators who is in practice, is going, or not going out to the site, but having the craftspeople send her images digitally, or there's a kind of digital transmission now that's happening of what used to be, orally passed down knowledge. And so I was even thinking of, Liang Xishang, the famous Chinese architect who I think in the 1930s came and trained at the University of Pennsylvania in Philly, and then went back and set up this Institute for Traditional Chinese Architecture, where again, there was like treatises, but to that date, it had not been, quote, documented. And so his way of documenting in his, famous book on Chinese architecture, again, was kind of going out into the field and documenting types or typologies, like, in that case, it was like temples or pagodas or, courtyard houses, etc. So I guess those are my thinkings on that.
Thanks for the kind words to Shannon, Pallavi. And Shannon, I would like to ask you, what are your experiences? Because you have worked in varied climatic conditions, like you have worked in Canada, worked in southern US, and you have been to Ladakh. Then you have worked for Adalaj, and also now working in the Shahjahanabad area. So all these places have different climatic condition, different geographic condition, geological conditions. Even the religious conditions are also different. So, and those are reflected in the architectural buildings and architectural design. So what are your experience working on those aspects?
Yeah, I mean, that's a really interesting question. And maybe just to and then that's why I think it's so important for students, to travel in their education. I was even thinking, when you were showing the Jalis, or even when I was thinking about, the stepwells, how they occupied these, they were layered, kind of performances ecologically, but as well as programmatically. And just to maybe, think about India, how now in the newer cities, I suppose there's a modernist idea of separating usages, but like how something like, the stepwell could at once be a kind of profane in terms of like a place for clothing, washing clothes or bathing, right? And then the sacred, but that we continue to see. I think I love, in India, that there is that kind of presence of both, or that you don't have the separation of usages in the older quarters, right? You have the commercial, the housing. It's all layered in this. I mean, what someone would term, I think Jeffrey Howe has a book called Messy Urbanism, but someone like Jane Jacobs would say these are amazing, like vibrant urban spaces. So I guess it's kind of calibrating, as you say, and being very aware of the localisms and celebrating that. In Sudbury, as I mentioned, we're on the Canadian Shield, and my students are currently working on an ecology center. We're even questioning, like, how do you ground that, right? So it's like you actually have to connect to the Shield. So the idea that the local geographies and landscapes are kind of driving a more regional based approach, and as you are also layering in that there, the production, like as opposed to international productions, how can we also look at how our traditional like makers in these regions did things which were arguably much more sophisticated in terms of the passive design that they could offer, the climatic, and even something that's if you're seeing the thumbprint, and I go back to the thumbprint of the Jali, that is really about the people there, like culturally significant. So yeah.
By looking at the Adalaj picture, I just wanted to mention one point, like these structures were actually need-based. And here in Rajasthan also, it's every 100 kilometers, you'll find one step well. And those are so elaborately designed and intricately carved. And because you'll find water at such a lower level, and at the same time you don't want to make a plain facade, so person accessing water must feel some interest on those facades. So those facades were created with the niches or some kind of spaces on either sides when you approach to step wells. So, and all these elements, or I would say the building craft, were actually need based and aesthetically treated. So we can't say they were just put in the buildings. So it just came in my mind, so I thought just to share the
Yeah,
point.
I mean, even just on that point, I was so fascinated when I first went into these and, quote, discovered them myself, like for my thesis in undergraduate at Carleton in the late 90s, that, you know, and this is also a kind of critique of Shajanabad, that it's, you know, with the kind of British mutiny, you know, there was this, and I think one of the, you know, previous discussants in this series talked about the fact that, you know, when the British came in India, they modernized, or in the name of hygiene, right? Like they put all the water systems into culverts, right? And then they privatized it or controlled that. Whereas there's this amazing gesture, like at the architecture and even the urban design, as you say, like in Adalaj or Ahmedabad, yeah, the water level was 7 levels below the ground. So in fact, these structures, they just have a lip, and they're like 7, in this case, 7 stories, you know, to go down and get the water. And of course, there's also an interesting kind of ephemerality that we look at in urban design today, that we design for, you know, ephemerality, you know, that they could actually, you know, change the water levels within them according to the monsoon. You know, there's of course more contemporary architects, well, one who's passed away, but Charles Correa, I love his work, you know, Doshi, who are looking at, I think, you know, looking at these traditional crafts, or even engage with traditional craftspeople in their, you know, in the execution of their projects, or again, make references to these traditional ways of even collecting water, as opposed to the modernization, which would have stuck it under a culvert, you know. And again, because I'm engaged in ecological urbanism, a lot of the strategies we now talk about, that it's better to, as Kanjian Yu from Turinscape in China has coined, like sponge cities, or that you let cities flood, you know, you allow spaces for the rivers, allow them to flood. So anyway, that's
If I may intervene, I think this idea that you're bringing forth, that recontextualizing the craft in the profession, is probably something that we have to look into as designers, as architects, as urban planners. But there is also a struggle that we face, right? When, especially, I mean, I am operating in Ottawa in Canada. There is a paucity, there is a scarcity of such craftsmen. And it is because it's that duality, right? Because we are not promoting it, so the profession is dying. We don't have craftspeople. And then that becomes difficult and time consuming. It becomes costly to find such people. You have to really invest a lot of energy. And in today's world, you know, you want houses to be built fast, and you want to deliver at a machine pace. But that's the kind of dilemma that we find ourselves in, where we don't have the craftsmen. How do we bring them in? But again, it's our duty to actually foster these. I don't know what you think about that, Kavita, and especially you're in it, but also Shannon. How do you think this reinvigoration of the crafts, how will we deal with that dilemma? Kavita, do you want to start?
Yeah.
And then
Yeah. Actually, it's a dilemma, because we have scarcity of these craftsmen. And what's happening today, the sons of craftsmen, or the new generation of these craftspeople, they also want to study and after studying higher education, they'll not work at site. So this is the situation. So, and because of that, the social condition is changed, and also the economics is also changed. Earlier they were in abundance, so they were working, and the material was also available. So these craft techniques were easily done at sites. And I would say the economics has also changed. Nowadays these materials are not so much in abundance. Also the scarcity of craftsmen, and these techniques are time consuming, it takes time, so it becomes costly affair. So the economics has actually changed. So very few people would go for these traditional building techniques. They want faster construction, and they just want their projects to be completed. But I think at the same time we should not let this technique die. So we'll have to prepare the new generation for keeping these techniques alive. So we'll have to find out a way, not in urban areas, but we can find people, those who are actually interested in working these techniques, not for the money, but those who are actually into it. So they just need a platform. They just need that someone can guide them properly, and then they can work on that. So I think that's the way we can follow, we can use it.
One of the points I had made just with our studio, right? We were talking about this as professors because, again, the students have this really rich, they work with the land-based learning, they work with Indigenous elders, and harvest the landscape essentially as a live material, and work with it. And, and then they're just, just about kind of reflecting, and then there's almost like a disconnect, right? Where we move into, quote, an architectural project, which is dictated. And I saw the question by Kurt in the room, like by code or by, as you said, like standardized efficient materials, like, sawn wood, stick frame construction, which is really standardized. And as Pallavi has mentioned, there's this kind of notion of efficiency. I showed you the extractive landscapes in Sudbury, right? Where it's like this idea of the landscape or the local materials are thought of as simply something that we can extract, right? So, I mean, one of the things in the studio that we've been now looking at is a lot of the more innovative mass timber or wood, which arguably is a much more haptic material. It's also, it it sequesters carbon, right? It's sustainable. But I think, what is now happening with like the advent of 3D technologies, right? That are like 3D digital cutting, that maybe and we're exploring this, like, is there a way to kind of go back to maybe the craft, the crafts, the local, but work with that, like the 3D as a tool, maybe to negotiate that. So that's certainly something we've been looking at. And as well, I was also even thinking when Kavita was presenting the facades, I was thinking, of again, maybe as transmitted through the new 3D digital abilities of 3D cutting, or, of the terracotta facades, right? There's a lot now, but it's, it's using digital, but it's also maybe returning more to what we could have done, or what we did do with craftspeople. So I'm wondering if there's a way, and, I started also talking about the community engagement that we're doing with Shajanabad. I didn't very clearly, I don't think, mention that we were planning on engaging with local craftspeople and having the students do prototyping with them. So if there's a way to, in a, like, arguably, 3D printing and digital is more, it's still efficient, but if there's ways to kind of negotiate that where craftspeople are also part of those processes. And also what we had spoken about in preparing for this was the, quote, advent of the, or the silver lining of the pandemic that is arguably forced us to do this digitally, and whether or not it's, that a craftsperson is going to be digitally or remotely teaching and doing prototyping with my students in Sudbury. Like, so I think that those are interesting to think about. Maybe what is the role of the digital? Are there ways of, keeping these at once have been, oral traditions or passed down through word? Maybe there's, it's not that, the digital is necessarily nefarious or replacing the craftspeople, but maybe there's a way that they can work together.
Absolutely. And Shannon, I do want to emphasize that point that you made about looking at the positive side of the pandemic and almost realizing that the digital is here to stay. But I mean, we've been realizing that for a little bit now, but also more reinforced in the pandemic. And this idea that maybe it can be used to an advantage in documenting these crafts which would otherwise be lost, and the oral traditions. But this there are several questions, and you've been discussing this in our past meetings with Kavita, you and the team, that how does the dissemination of these oral traditions, the earlier oral traditions, and the ethical implications of those, right? It's their knowledge. In the past, the medieval times, it was the occult. They safeguarded their knowledge as craftspeople. There were a special group of people who knew it, and they were the privileged people who could do it. But now with this dissemination, what kind of ethical questions? And this is something that you had brought up earlier, Shannon and Kavita, and maybe we could hear a little bit about that.
I think each and every, Shannon, are you speaking?
Oh, do you want to go first?
No, please.
Okay. Well, I mean, I think that is an ongoing discussion. What are the ethical implications of that, right? I mean, so I think this idea of really, community engagement, I just use the Shajanabad example, where the stakeholders and the constituents and the local, the craftspeople are really forefront as part of, the discussions for these, I mean, what we're proposing as interventions. I think one of our collaborators is actually a consultant on the Delhi master plan. So I think it's, again, being, respectful and inclusionary of the craftspeople, right? So I think that there is a fine line that needs to be kind of negotiated, right, with maybe the digitization or the documentation of previously oral-based knowledge. So I do think that is certainly something we need to be cognizant of and continually discussing or constantly at the forefront of discourse.
In addition to what Shannon has said, I would like to mention one more point. Other than the documentation, I think incentive are also important. We must give some incentive to the craftspeople. Otherwise, the new people will not be created. And what we have today will soon be very less in numbers. So unless and until they get some recognition, some incentive, this technique will not be promoted, cannot be promoted.
I mean, I'm just thinking, I know in India, I remember studying the SEWA, the Self-Employed Women's Association out of Ahmedabad, I think, that began in Ahmedabad because of course, there's a lot of mill owners there. There were a lot of mills. And so there were these, women in precarious lines of work, I think dyeing those amazing like batiking or blocking fabrics. So I think that they did self-organize, right? So maybe again, it's also, forming collaboratives or co-ops in a way that, again, that's an example I know from India. Like microfinancing, and again, architects maybe as agents to, weave in these very valuable works. I mean, I know that, one of my collaborators is doing a lot of contemporary design, and certainly, as Kavita was saying, she's really engaged with hybrid of these, traditional jalis, for their cultural associations and importances and their sheer beauty. And they're becoming also part of contemporary architectural proposals. So again, I think that there's a way to, in the division or engagement of labor to include, be inclusionary with these practices, and as architects promote the inclusion of these practices in our work.
Yeah. In the chat box, there is one question. I think by our discussion, the question is already answered. Like the presentation, one is asked, do these traditional and indigenous approaches through design reconcile with our current architectural and interior design practices? So which are technologically and code incentive? I think we have already spoken.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah.
And Kurt has asked that question, but I think he has also almost made a statement at the end, if I can say that. It's, yes, and after our conversation, the design education and professionals themselves need to evolve. I would probably make that into a statement that rather than a question now after listening to all of you. So I'm just being heedful of the time here, and our team has questions for you. So we will open up to those questions, if that's okay with both of you.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Are we starting with who's going to start with the questions?
I will. So I have one for Shannon. So when reading your article, which was titled Logjammed, and as you spoke about today, there was many debates going on between various parties about how to use the structure that was left behind by Domtar, the paper company in Chaudière Falls. And this spanned like quite a long duration, this whole debate on how to use it. So with your knowledge, when is this type of historic site and historic architecture and structure worth preserving for today's like modern society, rather than like simply like rebuilding and kind of avoiding all of that adaptive reuse and that kind of conflict that arises basically between trying to balance the social, cultural, economic, and environmental pressures?
Yeah, I mean, that's a really great question. I'm not trained as an architectural conservationist, which is why I'm so excited to be collaborating actually with the School of Planning and Architecture and Anuradha, Chaturvedi and Smita, who are trained as conservationists. I mean, I think there's a whole discourse on, intangible culture, right? And even, certainly, because I am an urban designer as well, and that was a waterfront, right? So there's a kind of discourse now that we don't just want to, in our industrial waterfronts anyway, our post-industrial waterfronts, we don't want to just, quote, recover the landscape. I mean, obviously there's aspects that the landscape does need to be recovered. And I think in that article I wrote about, a brownfield condition where, because there's been industry, there's, design strategies actually that can go in and clean the landscape, and also, have performative aspects for, public space, or clean the water because that was also contaminated. But at the same time, in just to use the Chaudière as an example, there are these industrial artifacts, right? So I guess the question, and again, there's experts who can talk much better than I can, but what is the cultural significance of these, right? So in our case, it with the Chaudière, it does talk about a specific industrial industry that was, quote, the impetus for the founding of Ottawa as settlers. So there is an argument that these should be preserved and adaptively reused, but again, not all. Obviously, I mean, there's different, I suppose, jurisdictions that have different attitudes. When I moved from Ottawa, I lived in Boston for about 10 years, and working as a contractor, they, perhaps more nefariously called it the hysterical commission, right? Or as opposed to the historical commission, because there was a kind of attitude that everything should be preserved, even, if it didn't, quote, have a specific cultural significance. So I think it's just, it's a very great question. I think it's perhaps a complicated answer, because I think that there's different, aspects of what of cultural, what is culturally significant. And just to go back with the article, I really looked at this, again, discourse, thinking that it's a more of a palimpsest approach, where yes, you want to do a kind of landscape or ecological recovery because it's on a waterfront. These places did occupy really significant, essentially a lot of our North American or Canadian cities were along waterfronts because of the previous industry and the fluvial transportation system, right? So again, a lot of these have been abandoned, but in terms of like the post-industrial city, they show real possibilities for reoccupation, right? Through different, maybe it's, public spaces. But again, that kind of palimpsest is that these are very valuable post-industrial artifacts that we should, preserve, but maybe not all of them.
Yeah, that was a great response. I know it's a very complex question, especially, some of I feel like is kind of answered in itself, like to say, when is it worth preserving when it has all of these different things to balance with the social, cultural, economic, and environmental. It's like, that's why it's worth preserving, is because of all of those things. If it didn't have all that rich significance, we would just perhaps just demo and rebuild for something that we know we need. But thank you for that answer. That was really insightful.
Yeah, that was really great. And I guess just bridging from this conversation, I would like to pose a question to Kavita. So when considering the intersection of modern day technology, oral traditions, and the origins of lime stucco, the idea that there is this loss of information from traditional craftsmen presents itself. I'm wondering, how can we regain this knowledge and information in order to be able to restore historic buildings, and in turn use that information to inform our modern technologies, so they too can aid in this revitalization of building craft?
Okay, thank you. It's a very good question. And I would say, like, it's very true that there is this loss of information as the craftsmen are reducing in present day times. So it becomes important, like, how we regain this knowledge in order to be able to restore our heritage buildings. So it can be done two ways. Either we teach our new craftsmen, or we learn from them. So both ways can be worked out. So we learn from our senior or experienced craft people who has the skill in their mind, and then we document it, we analyze it, and then teach to newer generations. And those new generation may be even the craftspeople, or to our designers, or young architects. So I think it can be worked out in both ways. We learn from this community, and in turn we dissipate knowledge to newer generation, to newer craftspeople. And the same technology, yes, there are some limitation or constraints. The same technologies can be used for revitalizing the historic buildings. And but again, as I said, due to the time constraints, or it's a time taking process and costly, so it may not be so used in all the buildings. But yes, in some buildings these techniques may be used. So this is how we can regain this knowledge.
Thank you. That's really great to see kind of how it is possible for these amazing skills and crafts to sort of transcend culture and also time. So thank you for that.
Thank you. Thank you, Lexi.
All right, I have a question now for Shannon. So
When comparing the reconstruction projects in your article that you have mentioned today, Logjammed, and New Economies of Landscape in its new urban form, one looks at the conservation of industrial heritage within the Dumtar paper mill, while the later focuses on post-disaster in Sichuan, China. Do these contrasting adaptive reuse projects keep cultural identities in the forefront?
Yeah, that's a really great question. Those are interesting contrasts. I mean, I think, there's, we talk about preservation of quote history, but then again, you have these these literally like natural disasters like in Sichuan. So this was just to give people a background. I didn't talk about it, but I've also been very engaged in teaching and research in China. I mean, for 10 years, basically, I lived every summer in China. So this was the Sichuan earthquake that happened in 2008. But again, it could be a lot of natural disasters, even Adalaj, I think back in, what was it, the late 90s or the early 2000s, I think they had an earthquake. So I think there was some damage maybe. So I guess, it's going from like preservation, and to effectively reconstructing, but like, I suppose the question would be, how would, what principles would you engage with in reconstruction? Like, hopefully it would be, relating back to some of the, the strategies that Kavita was showing with, the jalis, which as an example, that are so intricate and layered as in terms of performative ecologies, like through passive design, about the climate and the landscape, but also about the, the traditional kind of peoples to be engaged. So maybe bringing that question, to the Shajanabad that we're now working on, which is a very, it's a very culturally, historically significant site. Again, a lot of, I think what Kavita has talked about in the traditional arts people involved in the production, quote, of architecture, was very much embodied in that original city in terms of at nested scales of urbanism, ecologies, and even the architecture in the, the courtyard spaces, which also Kavita, I think, was talking about how, the cooling effect, the capturing prevailing winds, and how that also kind of, is something that we experience architecturally. So again, within Shajanabad, it's kind of like, okay, what do you decide to quote keep and preserve, or is it so, has there been so much quote degradation, or, that you might want to even just rethink about maybe engaging with craftspeople to, to create prototypes of what would have been there originally, but have kind of been, again, erased over time, right? So not sure if that answers your question. It's kind of like, but it's interesting because it provokes me to think about something where you absolutely want to preserve, or something where you absolutely have to reconstruct from new, or that, and again, in the Shajanabad case, that it's, there's historical, which needs to be preserved, but maybe just because of over time, it's been so erased by modernization, by pressures of globalization, or like a lot of migration or overcrowding, that it at once, you do maybe have to actually design something new, but that maybe, speaks of what its original kind of function was. So I'm just, thinking as well of what we've been discussing today. Maybe that is through the active engagement, again, in community-based participation and planning, ways to bring in these local craftspeople, who again, maybe like, again, through over centuries, when their ancestors might have been actually part of the original construction of this, right? And try to weave those, what Julia Watson would term low tech, meaning low, LO, local, and tech, she's more referring to traditional ecological knowledges, because, and again, in her book of that same name, Low Tech, she actually did go to a lot of indigenous communities, and track more through the point of view of landscape, right? Like the big, amazing root bridges you see in India that were really built by the local people with an indigenous like knowledge of landscape. So yeah, like how do you bring that to the forefront? But again, you know, you are tasked with what Kurt has talked about. You're tasked with code. You're tasked with kind of efficiency. You're tasked with, quote, a modern city that, you know, still has to function. So I think these are all, maybe that's not really an answer, but it's just, you know, it's trying to maybe weave together a lot of what we've talked about today.
Yeah, thank you very much. That's good.
So now I have a question for Kavita. Why have we strayed from traditional building methods such as limestone when they served us so well in the past?
Yeah, exactly. You are very true. Like we have actually strayed from traditional building methods when we have availability of traditional material. But the reality is like the context has changed, I would say. Nowadays, the modern buildings are coming up and our architects or designers travel distant places and they get inspired with the modern buildings with the metal and glass. So every designer wants to construct a high-rise building. So one thing is this key, the building scale is altogether changed and the time has changed, economics has changed, and um, also the few masons can work using these traditional materials. Not all masons know about the nature of this material. So there is a monopoly, I can say the monopoly also, and or I can say limitation in knowledge also. So very few people can work with this material. And this limestone is not a material, something which is being manufactured, but it is available. So the availability is also reduced. It's unlike cement or other material which is actually manufactured. So this stone is nowadays available in very little quantity. And as I also explained in during my presentations, this working with lime mortar or working with limestone is a time taking process. It takes a lot of time to set. So no one has this much patience to to take so much time for their buildings or for their projects. So all these constraints and limitations are leading to you know less use of these traditional material like limestone. So indirectly I can say it has become a costly technique. So all these reasons are actually becoming the main factor of not using the limestone. I
No,
think I hope I have answered your question.
no, you have definitely. Thank you. Yeah, you can definitely see, because I am from Bermuda, they used to build our houses out of limestone. You can tell now that they've strayed from building them and gone to concrete. So you can kind of just see how the traditional building methods has also changed just around the world. So thank you for that.
Thank you.
Thank you for those lovely questions. And it's been a wonderful almost 2 hours that we've been talking, and it's been so wonderful. I didn't realize we are so over time. But these wonderful, I think it's given me a great start to my weekend. So many ideas coming to my head about I can already think of what is a digitized craft, or what is this craft of the digital that we are probably talking about. Is there some kind of a synergy between that and being very realistic, right? I mean, we cannot say we just have to go into the crafts, or we become CAD monkeys, as I love that term, CAD monkeys. And I always say, don't become a CAD monkey, think critically. To my students, I think I've repeated that a number of times to them. They'll be like, don't say that again, but here I go. But I think it's been so lovely. I don't know if we want to have some last comments before we wind up this wonderful session.
I just wanted to actually thank you again, Pallavi, and the students from Algonquin for organizing such a wonderful series of webinars. I mean, I really, really enjoyed them. And I mean, I've enjoyed participating. Thank you again. And I've actually really enjoyed the discourse, you know, with Kavita as well. And I actually hope that if we are in India in the fall, we can come visit, because you're part of our Delhi triangle, where we do go to Jaipur, because of course it was similar to Shahjahanabad, an old walled city. So I would just actually like to thank you and the students so much for hosting this, and to Kavita for the wonderful discourse, and to the attendees.
Yes.
Thanks, Shannon. You are most welcome in Jaipur. And thanks for the wonderful presentation. I actually liked the projects which you are doing. And thanks a lot to Pallavi and all the students. And but just a small message to all the students, like apply common sense. We don't have to copy, or we don't have to just follow, but just apply common sense.
Or
This is what I
criticality,
would
critical
say.
thinking, and common sense.
So thanks to all.
And Kavita, we would love to have you over sometime here in Canada as well.
Sure.
Because you've got this very unique way of thinking, and probably working with the craftsmen. So probably, Shannon, we can talk more on what
Absolutely.
ways we can collaborate.
Yeah. Why not? Even I'm eager to come over there. You just let us know. It would be great.
Thank you again. And as Shannon rightly reminded me, thank you to the audience for the questions. And this webinar will be later available on our YouTube page for viewing later. So please go ahead and also subscribe if you can. It almost sounds like, I don't like that kind of, but it's nice because we'll have more of such conversations as we go forth. And that is where we are going to collect all of it. So if you want to get back to it at any point. And stay tuned for our next webinar, which is happening on the 20th again.
Okay.
Thank you again, Shannon and Kavita, and to all my wonderful students here.
Thank you, and bye.
Thank you.
Bye.